Imagine, if you will, the vast, shimmering expanse of the Mediterranean Sea in the year 260 BC. It is a world dominated by a single naval superpower, Carthage. Their ships control the trade routes, their sailors know every current and wind pattern, and their naval technology is centuries ahead of any rival. On the other side of this equation stands the Roman Republic. At this moment in history, Rome is a land power, a master of legions and infantry, but it possesses no navy, no warships, and absolutely no maritime tradition. In fact, Roman soldiers are reportedly so unfamiliar with the sea that the very concept of naval warfare is alien to them. And yet, the Senate orders the impossible. They demand a fleet. Not just a few transport vessels, but a massive armada of 120 heavy warships, capable of challenging the Carthaginian masters of the sea. But here is the truly staggering part, the detail that defies belief even to modern engineers. They ordered this fleet to be built, launched, and crewed in just 60 days. How does a civilization with no blueprints, no shipyards, and no shipwrights manufacture a dominant navy from scratch in 2 months? Today, we will deconstruct one of the greatest engineering and logistical miracles of the ancient world. We will examine the industrial mobilization, the reverse engineering of enemy technology, and the radical tactical innovations that allowed Rome to turn the sea into dry land. We will look at the physics of the Roman warship and the hidden training systems that saved them from disaster. Thus, we are not just telling a story of war, but of project management, supply chains, and sheer audacity. Stay with us and watch until the end to understand how a single piece of washed-up debris changed the course of Western history forever. To understand the magnitude of this undertaking, we must first establish the historical and geopolitical context of the First Punic War. The year is 264 BC, and Rome has crossed the Strait of Messina into Sicily. This island is the flashpoint. The Romans quickly realize that while their legions are invincible on the solid earth of Sicily, they can never win the war as long as Carthage controls the coastlines. Carthage can resupply its cities by sea, blockade Roman ports, and strike anywhere at will. The Carthaginian warship of choice is the quinquereme, a massive galley powered by 5 banks of oars, fast, agile, and equipped with a bronze ram designed to smash through enemy hulls. Rome, by contrast, has ferries. They have small trading vessels. They do not have the complex engineering knowledge required to build a quinquereme. This is a vessel that requires precise hydrodynamics to prevent capsizing and complex internal architecture to house 300 rowers. The Roman predicament in 260 BC is equivalent to a nation today that has only ever built bicycles, suddenly deciding to build a fleet of jet fighters in 8 weeks. The first major problem, therefore, was not just labor, but knowledge. How do you build what you have never seen? History tells us that fortune favored the Romans. A Carthaginian quinquereme, perhaps run aground by a storm or a piloting error, was captured by the Romans. This shipwreck became the most important artifact in Roman naval history. It served as the prototype. But simply having a ship does not mean you can replicate it 100 times over. Can you imagine what would have happened if they had tried to redesign the ship from scratch? They would have failed. Instead, the Roman engineers treated the captured ship as a master template. We will now examine the foundation of their solution, which lies in a concept we often attribute to the Industrial Revolution: standardization and modular construction. The Roman engineers realized that to build 120 ships in 60 days, they could not treat each ship as a unique work of art. In traditional shipbuilding, a master shipwright crafts each timber to fit the specific quirks of that hull. Rome did not have time for quirks. They dismantled the Carthaginian ship, plank by plank, and essentially created a kit. We have archaeological evidence from later periods, specifically from the Punic shipwrecks found off the coast of Marsala, that ship parts were often marked with letters and numbers, instruction manuals written directly onto the wood. The Romans adopted this method with aggressive efficiency. They effectively turned the beachheads of Italy into a massive assembly line. Thousands of trees were felled in the interior forests. We will discuss the logistics of this shortly, but the engineering genius here was the decision to sacrifice longevity for speed. Standard naval practice dictates that wood must be seasoned, dried out, for months or years to prevent warping and rot. Rome used green wood, timber freshly cut from the tree. Why is this significant? Green wood is heavier and more prone to warping, making the ships slower and less durable than their Carthaginian counterparts. However, it is softer and easier to cut, speeding up production. The Romans accepted that their ships would be inferior in quality. They made a calculated engineering trade-off. A heavy, clumsy fleet today is better than a perfect fleet 2 years from now. Write in the comments how you think you would have handled this decision. Would you prioritize speed or quality in a war for survival? We will now look at the key technology that defined these ships, the quinquereme design itself. The word quinquereme comes from the Latin for 5 oars. For a long time, historians debated what this meant. Did it have 5 levels of oars stacked on top of each other? Structurally, that would be impossible. The ship would be too tall and unstable. The consensus among modern historians and engineers is that the 5 referred to the number of men in a vertical column of oars. It likely featured 3 levels of oars: 2 men on the top oar, 2 men on the middle oar, and 1 man on the bottom oar. This 2-2-1 configuration created a dense, high-power engine room. But the Romans knew their ships, built of green wood and copied by inexperienced carpenters, would be slower and less maneuverable than the seasoned Carthaginian fleet. If they tried to engage in a traditional naval battle, which involved complex maneuvering to ram the enemy, they would lose. The Carthaginians could dance circles around them. This leads us to the true Roman stroke of genius, a device that fundamentally altered the mechanics of naval warfare: the corvus. The corvus, or crow, was a boarding bridge. It was a brilliant application of civil engineering to a maritime problem. The device consisted of a gangplank, roughly 1.2 meters wide and 11 meters long, mounted on a pivot at the prow of the ship. At the end of this gangplank was a massive, heavy iron spike shaped like a bird's beak. A system of pulleys allowed the bridge to be raised against a pole, standing vertical like a scorpion's tail. Here is how the system worked. The Roman pilot would steer his heavy, clumsy ship directly toward a Carthaginian vessel. He didn't need to outmaneuver the enemy, he just needed to get close. Once adjacent, the pulley was released. Gravity took over. the heavy bridge crashed down onto the enemy deck. The iron spike punched through the timber of the Carthaginian deck, locking the two ships together in a death grip. Suddenly, the naval battle was over. The ships were now a floating platform. Roman marines, heavily armed and disciplined, would charge across the bridge. The superior seamanship of the Carthaginians was rendered instantly useless. By turning the sea into land, Rome could utilize its greatest strength: close-quarters infantry combat. Stay with us, because later we will discuss why this brilliant invention was eventually abandoned, as it carried a deadly flaw. Let us now consider the internal layout and social logic of these vessels. A quinquereme was not just a machine, it was a pressure cooker of humanity. Inside the hull, arranged on benches, were 300 rowers. In the Roman model, these were not galley slaves, as is often depicted in Hollywood movies. In this emergency mobilization, they were largely soci navales, naval allies, and poorer citizens conscripted for the task. The organization required to make 300 men row in unison is staggering. If one bank of oars clashes with another, the entire rhythm breaks. The ship loses momentum, and in combat, you die. The internal system relied on the hortator, a man with a drum or a hammer keeping the beat. The social logic was brutal but effective. Absolute obedience to the rhythm. The air below deck would have been stifling, filled with the smell of sweat, unseasoned wood, and fear. Yet, this human engine had to function perfectly from day one. This brings us to the logistical nightmare of the 60 days. How do you physically construct 120 ships in that time frame? We must look at the materials. A single quinquereme requires approximately 4,000 to 5,000 cubic meters of wood. For 120 ships, we are talking about deforesting substantial areas of the Apennine Mountains. The logistics of felling these trees, stripping them, transporting them downriver to the shipyards, likely at Ostia or nearby beaches, and processing them is a feat of supply chain management that rivals the construction of the Colosseum. We must assume the Romans utilized a dispersed manufacturing model. They likely didn't build all ships in one spot. They would have activated every available carpenter, joiner, and woodworker in central Italy. The metal fittings, the bronze rams, the iron nails, the spikes for the corvus, would have required the full capacity of Rome's smithies. It was a total war economy. However, the most critical material was the crew. You can build a ship in 2 months, but you cannot train a professional rower in 2 months. Or can you? This brings us to a hidden system, a detail recorded by the historian Polybius that shows the Roman commitment to efficiency. While the ships were still being hammered together on the beaches, the Romans did not let the crews sit idle. They built wooden skeletons on dry land, benches arranged exactly as they would be in the ships. The potential rowers sat on these dry ships for weeks, practicing the motion of the oar in the air. They learned to keep time, they built the specific muscles required for rowing, and they learned the commands of the officers. Can you imagine the scene? Tens of thousands of men sitting on beaches, rowing the air, preparing for a battle on an element they had never navigated. It seems almost comical, yet it was this simulator training that allowed them to launch the fleet and immediately sail to Sicily. Without this parallel processing, building the ships and the crews simultaneously, the project would have failed. How long do you think it would take you to learn to row in perfect synchronization with 299 other people. Despite this genius, we must address the why. Why can we not, or why do we not, recreate this kind of mobilization today? There are several reasons. First, the environmental cost. The Romans stripped old-growth forests without hesitation. Today, sustainable sourcing of that much specific timber, oak for the hull, pine for the interior, fir for the oars, would be legally and ethically impossible in such a short window. Second, the labor laws. The Roman system relied on conscription and a disregard for individual society that modern society does not accept. The work hours were likely dawn to dusk, with no safety regulations. Third, the complexity of modern systems. A Roman ship was wood, iron, rope, and linen. A modern warship is electronics, radar, propulsion, and missiles. The minimum viable product approach works for a wooden hull. It does not work for a nuclear submarine. However, the Roman example teaches us about good enough engineering. They didn't need the best ships. They needed ships now. There is also a tragic side to the engineering of these ships, specifically the corvus, which we promised to return to. While the corvus won Rome the early battles, such as the stunning victory at Mylae, it had a fatal structural flaw. Placing over a ton of weight, the bridge and the iron spike high up on the prow of the ship raised the center of gravity. In rough weather, this made the ships incredibly unstable. If the ship rocked too far, the leverage of the heavy corvus would capsize the vessel. In 255 BC, a storm destroyed a Roman fleet, killing nearly 100,000 men, arguably the greatest naval disaster in maritime history. Historians and engineers believe the instability caused by the corvus was the primary culprit. Eventually, as Roman seamanship improved, they removed the device. They no longer needed the training wheels. So, what is the modern relevance of this story? The building of the Roman Navy in 60 days is the ultimate case study in crisis management and adaptation. It teaches us that when an organization or a nation is backed into a corner, the rules of how things are done can be rewritten. The Romans abandoned the idea of perfection. They accepted the use of green wood. They accepted that their pilots were amateurs. They compensated for these weaknesses with a single technological disruptor, the corvus, and brute force logistics. In the end, Rome did not win because they were better sailors. They won because they were better engineers and organizers. They turned a complex art form into an industrial process. Within a few years, the Mediterranean, once a Carthaginian lake, became Mare Nostrum, our sea. As we reflect on this, it is fascinating to consider how often history is decided not by tactics on the battlefield, but by the speed of the assembly line back home. We have covered the origin, the engineering, the labor, and the tactical genius of the Roman fleet. But history is full of these impossible moments. What other ancient engineering feats would you like us to deconstruct? Do you think the Roman strategy of quantity over quality is still valid in modern industry? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Roman engineering, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss our next documentary. We will see you in the next video.